The choice that changed everything. Ethan Caldwell stood on the balcony of his penthouse, a glass of whiskey swirling lazily in his hand. The New York skyline stretched before him, glittering like a kingdom he had built from nothing. Every inch of his life was meticulously crafted, wealth, power, and influence all bent to his will. Yet despite everything, a hollow ache lingered in his chest, an emptiness he refused to acknowledge. Tonight was the biggest night of his life. The announcement of his engagement to Charlotte Harrington, heiress to the vast Harrington fortune, was set to make waves across the business world. It was the perfect merger, two empires joining forces, solidifying their dominance. But behind the grandeur and applause, a ghost of his past lingered in the shadows of his mind. Claire Thompson, the woman he had once promised forever, the woman he had left behind. 3 years ago, rain poured relentlessly the night Ethan made the decision that would shape his future. He had been pacing his office for hours, torn between two lives, one that offered love and the unknown, and another that promised power and certainty. Claire had come to him that night, her eyes wide with unspoken fears. "You don't have to do this," she had whispered, gripping his hands as if her touch alone could tether him to the life they had built. "We can find another way, Ethan. We always do." But Ethan had already made up his mind. The company was on the verge of collapse, and the only way to secure its future was through an alliance with the Harrington family. Love, in all its reckless uncertainty, had no place in a world dictated by wealth and survival. "You don't understand," he had told her, his voice cold and distant. "This is bigger than us, Claire. I can't throw away everything I've worked for because of a fleeting dream." Claire had stepped back, her face pale. "A fleeting dream," she echoed, her voice cracking. "That's what we were to you." Ethan had hesitated. He had wanted to say no, to tell her she was everything. But the weight of expectation crushed his resolve. "This is the only way," he had said instead. Claire had stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the man she had fallen in love with. When she found nothing, her expression hardened. "Then I hope your empire keeps you warm at night," she had whispered before turning and walking out the door. Ethan had let her go, convincing himself it was for the best. That night, he had made his choice. And now, standing in a ballroom filled with champagne and celebration, surrounded by the elite of high society, he wondered why, despite all his success, he still felt like he had lost. The return. The gala was in full swing when Ethan noticed the shift in the air. A quiet murmur spread through the room, heads turning toward the entrance as if the very fabric of the evening had been disturbed. He followed their gazes and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Claire. She stood in the grand entrance, poised and radiant, in a deep emerald dress that hugged her frame. But it wasn't just her presence that made Ethan's breath catch. It was the two small boys standing beside her, their hands clutching hers. Twins. Identical. And unmistakably his. Ethan's grip tightened around his glass as the realization struck like a thunderbolt. The boys, his sons, had his eyes, the same stormy gray that stared back at him in the mirror every morning. The room faded into white noise. The empire he had spent years building, the carefully curated facade of control, cracked in an instant. Before he knew it, his feet were moving. He barely registered the whispers that followed his steps as he cut through the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. Claire met his gaze head-on, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes. Defiance, guarded strength. "Claire," he breathed, stopping just in front of her. The two boys clutched their mother's hands tightly, their identical faces looking up at him with innocent curiosity. One seemed bolder, meeting his gaze with open interest, while the other stayed slightly behind, watching him with quiet caution. Ethan's throat tightened. "They're mine," he said, though it was less of a question and more of a realization spoken aloud. Claire's jaw clenched. "They're mine," she corrected, her voice calm but firm. Ethan felt the weight of her words like a punch to the gut. He looked at the boys again, his mind racing. How? Why hadn't she told him? His voice was hoarse when he spoke. Why didn't you tell me? Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. Because you made your choice, Ethan. Memories of that fateful night flashed in his mind. The way she had begged him to stay. The way he had walked away. But this was more than just a failed relationship. This was his family. Ethan opened his mouth, desperate for words, but before he could speak, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Ethan. Charlotte. She had appeared at his side, her expression composed but her eyes sharp as they flicked between Claire and the boys. Who are they? Charlotte asked, her voice cool but laced with a silent demand for answers. Claire lifted her chin. His sons, she said simply. The impact of those words rippled through the room. Gasps, murmurs, and shocked glances spread like wildfire. Ethan barely noticed. His world had just been turned upside down. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he had made the right choice. The unraveling truth. The silence that followed Claire's revelation was deafening. The gala, once a symphony of clinking glasses and polite laughter, had gone eerily still. It was as if the entire room had collectively held its breath, waiting for Ethan's reaction. Charlotte's grip on Ethan's arm tightened. Her expression remained composed, but Ethan could feel the tension radiating from her. She was a woman who prided herself on control, just like him. But this was something neither of them had prepared for. Claire, on the other hand, stood unshaken. Her eyes never wavered from Ethan's, her posture straight and unyielding. The two small boys at her side, however, were less composed. The bolder of the two, the one who had met Ethan's gaze without fear, tugged at Claire's hand impatiently. "Mom," he whispered, his voice carrying despite the quiet. "Can we go now?" The other boy, the one who had been watching from behind Claire's legs, peeked up at Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and caution. His small fingers clutched the fabric of his mother's dress. Claire sighed softly and looked down at them. "Yes, Theo, we're leaving now," she said gently, her voice carrying none of the steel she had used with Ethan. But Ethan couldn't let her leave. Not now. Not after this. Wait. His voice was raw, edged with an urgency he had never felt before. Claire froze, her jaw tightening. "You can't just drop this on me and walk away," he said, his voice low, careful. He wasn't used to losing his composure in public, but this was different. This wasn't a business deal gone awry, or a minor scandal to sweep under the rug. This was his blood. "My sons," he repeated, the weight of the words settling into his chest like bricks. "How long?" Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. 3 years. 3 years. The realization hit Ethan like a freight train. 3 years of first words, first steps, first birthdays. 3 years of a life he had never known existed. He clenched his fists. "Why, Claire?" Her gaze hardened. "Because you made it very clear where I stood in your life. I wasn't going to beg you to be a father to children you never even knew you wanted." His chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong. But was she? Hadn't he walked away that night and left her alone? Hadn't he chosen wealth, power, and security over her? Before he could say another word, the soft voice of one of the twins cut through the tension. "Are you our dad?" Ethan inhaled sharply. It was the quieter one. "Theo." Claire turned to look at her son, her expression softening for just a second before she met Ethan's gaze again, silently daring him to answer. Ethan crouched down, trying to meet Theo's eyes on his level. His heart was pounding so hard it hurt. "Yes," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I'm your dad." Theo studied him for a long moment before nodding, as if filing the information away for later. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't hide behind Claire this time either. Oliver, the bolder twin, frowned up at Ethan. "Then where were you?" The question cut through Ethan like a blade. He swallowed hard. How could he explain? How could he tell these boys that he had chosen wrong? That he had let fear, ambition, and pride guide him instead of love? Before he could form an answer, Claire sighed. Enough, boys. We're leaving. Ethan's heart lurched. Claire, please. She paused. For the first time, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Hesitation. Uncertainty. But then she shook her head. Not here, Ethan. Not like this. He understood. A gala full of high-profile socialites wasn't the place to have this conversation. Claire nodded once to him before turning to leave, her sons following obediently. Ethan watched them go, his mind spinning. And he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting them walk out of his life again. The confrontation. By the time Ethan made it home that night, his mind was in turmoil. He paced the length of his penthouse, running a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched tight. He had spent years mastering control, making decisions that ensured his empire flourished. But he had never felt this helpless. 3 years. 3 years of missed birthdays. 3 years of moments he would never get back. And Claire. He had underestimated her. Not only had she built a life without him, but she had thrived. Claire Thompson wasn't the heartbroken woman he had left behind. She was stronger, sharper, and she had kept his sons from him. The thought sent a surge of something dark through him. A sharp knock at the door cut through his thoughts. He turned abruptly, half expecting Charlotte to be standing there, ready to demand an explanation. But when he opened the door, it was Claire. His breath caught. She was out of her evening gown now, dressed in simple jeans and a coat, her hair pulled back into a loose bun. But her expression was unreadable. I didn't come here to fight, she said before he could speak. I came because we need to talk. Ethan stepped aside, allowing her in. She moved past him with the same quiet confidence she had displayed at the gala. She wasn't the woman he had walked away from 3 years ago. She was someone new, someone who had learned to survive without him. He closed the door and turned to face her. You should have told me, he said, his voice lower now, rougher. Claire exhaled, crossing her arms. And what would you have done, Ethan, if I had told you back then? I would have. He stopped. Because the truth was, he didn't know. Would he have dropped everything? Chosen her and the twins over his empire? Claire shook her head. Exactly. You weren't ready. And I wasn't going to let my sons grow up feeling like they were second place. His chest ached. They are my sons, Claire, he said, his voice tight. She nodded. And now that you know, you have a choice to make. But this isn't about proving yourself to me, Ethan. This is about them. Ethan exhaled sharply. He had never backed down from a challenge before. He wasn't about to start now. What do I need to do? Claire studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Start here, she said, setting it down on the table. Ethan hesitated before picking it up. Inside were photographs, reports, little pieces of a life he had never known. A life he had lost. A life he was willing to do anything to reclaim. The battle for redemption. Ethan sat in his office, his hands gripping the edges of the thick folder Claire had given him. The weight of it was heavier than any billion-dollar contract he had ever signed. This wasn't a business deal. This was his sons' lives, a past he had missed, and a future he wasn't sure he had a right to claim. Inside were photographs, medical records, school reports, and handwritten notes in Claire's careful script. Every page was a piece of a puzzle he had never realized existed. The first picture stopped him cold. It was a simple image. Oliver and Theo on their second birthday. 2 identical boys sat on the floor, surrounded by balloons and a small cake. They had matching grins, their eyes bright with unfiltered joy. His sons. Ethan ran a hand over his face, a deep ache settling in his chest. 3 years. He had lost 3 years. And for the first time in his life, he couldn't blame anyone but himself. A deal to negotiate. The next day, Ethan walked into his company's boardroom with a singular focus. His executive team was already seated, waiting for him to address the crisis that had erupted overnight. Victoria Harrington sat at the head of the table, her polished nails tapping against the glass surface. She had been his fiancée for less than 24 hours before Claire's revelation had shattered the illusion of their perfect union. "You have some explaining to do," she said coolly. Ethan took his seat but ignored the undercurrent of hostility in her voice. "I don't owe you an explanation, Victoria." A flicker of anger passed through her expression, but she masked it quickly. "Oh, but you do. Our families have spent years aligning our companies for this partnership. And now, the media is having a field day with your secret children." Ethan clenched his jaw. "They're not a scandal. They're my sons." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "And where does that leave me?" The room was silent. Ethan inhaled deeply, his decision already made. "There is no us, Victoria." A slow, bitter smile curled on her lips. "I see," she said, nodding slightly. "So you're throwing away everything for a woman who left you and children you didn't even know existed." Ethan met her gaze head-on. "No, I threw it all away the day I let them go." For the first time, something in Victoria's face wavered. But she wasn't a woman who showed weakness for long. "This will cost you, Ethan," she said after a beat. He nodded. "I know." He had spent his life fighting to be at the top, but for the first time, he realized power meant nothing if he had no one to share it with. This was his battle now. Not for wealth, not for status, for his family. The first meeting. A week passed before Claire agreed to let Ethan see Oliver and Theo outside of a public setting. It wasn't in an office or a restaurant. It was in a small, quiet park in Brooklyn, far from the photographers and gossip columns that had been buzzing since the gala. Ethan arrived early. He had no idea what to expect. Would the boys even want to see him? Would they resent him for not being there? Then he saw them. Claire walked toward him, her posture guarded, but it was the two small boys beside her who made his breath hitch. Oliver was striding confidently ahead, his head held high like he had already made up his mind about something. Theo, however, stayed close to Claire, his small fingers curled around her hand. Ethan's heart pounded. Claire stopped a few feet away, giving him space but watching his every move. Ethan crouched down, forcing himself to smile. "Hey, guys." Oliver studied him for a moment before crossing his arms. "Are you really our dad?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yeah, Oliver, I am." Oliver squinted at him like he was still deciding if that was good or bad. "Prove it." Ethan blinked. "How?" Oliver glanced at Theo, then back at Ethan. "What's my favorite dinosaur?" Ethan hesitated. He had read through everything Claire had given him, but nowhere had it mentioned dinosaurs. Before he could answer, Theo mumbled, "It's a velociraptor." Oliver groaned. "Theo, he's supposed to guess." Ethan chuckled, the tightness in his chest loosening just slightly. "Velociraptor, ha. That's a good choice. Fast and smart." Oliver nodded approvingly. "Do you have a favorite?" Ethan smiled. "I think I might need some help picking one." Oliver's eyes lit up, and for the first time, Ethan saw something shift. A connection, however small, beginning to form. Theo, on the other hand, was still watching him quietly. Ethan turned to him. "What about you, Theo? What's your favorite?" Theo hesitated before whispering, "Brachiosaurus." Ethan nodded, making a mental note. A classic, strong and steady. Theo's lips twitched just slightly, but he didn't say anything else. Claire, who had been watching the exchange, finally spoke. "They don't trust easily, Ethan." He met her gaze, understanding the warning behind her words. "I know," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." A father's promise. Days passed, then weeks. Slowly but surely, Ethan began carving a place in his sons' lives. It started with small things, picking them up from daycare, helping with their bedtime stories, sitting through endless conversations about dinosaurs and outer space. Oliver warmed up to him quickly, always eager to talk, to test him, to see how much Ethan was willing to invest in knowing him. Theo, however, remained cautious. He observed more than he spoke, and though he never rejected Ethan outright, He kept his distance. One night, after dropping them off, Ethan lingered outside Claire's house, unsure why he couldn't bring himself to leave just yet. Claire stepped outside, folding her arms. "You don't have to hover, you know." Ethan exhaled. "Theo still doesn't trust me." Claire studied him for a moment. "Theo isn't Oliver. He doesn't give his heart away easily." Ethan nodded. "And how do I earn it?" She sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "By not giving up." Ethan met her gaze, a silent promise passing between them. He wasn't going to give up. Not on Theo. Not on Oliver. And not on Claire. For the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell knew exactly what he was fighting for. The road to redemption. The days turned into weeks, and Ethan found himself slipping into a role he had never anticipated: fatherhood. It wasn't easy. Oliver was quick to accept him, always the bold one, always full of questions and expectations. He wanted Ethan to prove himself, to earn his place. He threw rapid-fire questions at him, tested his knowledge of dinosaurs, space, and superheroes, and often challenged him in ways that no business executive ever had. Theo, on the other hand, was different. Quiet, observant, hesitant. Ethan noticed the way Theo always lingered behind his mother, the way he watched rather than engage. It wasn't that he disliked Ethan. It was that he wasn't sure if Ethan was going to stay. That realization hit harder than any business loss ever had. And Ethan knew he had no one to blame but himself. The test of trust. One Saturday morning, Ethan arrived at Claire's house as promised. Today was supposed to be an outing. A simple trip to the aquarium. Oliver was already at the door, hopping from foot to foot. "Are we gonna see the sharks first?" he demanded excitedly. Ethan chuckled. "We can start wherever you want, buddy." Theo, however, stood behind Claire, one hand clutching the hem of her coat. Ethan crouched down to his level. "What about you, Theo? Do you want to see the sea turtles?" Theo hesitated. Then, in a barely audible voice, he murmured, "Maybe." Claire watched the exchange with quiet scrutiny. Ethan straightened. "We'll go at your pace," he told him. The aquarium was busier than expected, and while Oliver had no problem weaving through the crowd, pointing out fish with exaggerated excitement, Theo stayed close to Ethan. Not to hold his hand, not to ask questions, just close. And Ethan realized, with a pang, that Theo was testing him. Would he notice? Would he slow down? Would he wait? So Ethan did. Whenever Oliver ran ahead, Ethan made sure to match Theo's pace, allowing him the time to look at each exhibit as long as he wanted. When Oliver begged to sit in the front row for the dolphin show, Ethan chose to sit in the quieter back row with Theo instead. And by the time they reached the jellyfish exhibit, something shifted. Theo tugged on Ethan's sleeve. Ethan looked down, startled. "The blue ones are my favorite," Theo murmured, pointing to the glowing creatures drifting serenely in the water. Ethan crouched beside him. "They're beautiful," he agreed. Theo nodded, his small fingers curling slightly around Ethan's wrist for just a second. It was the first time Theo had willingly reached out to him, and Ethan knew he was getting closer. A father's resolve. Later that evening, after the boys had been dropped off at home and tucked into bed, Ethan lingered outside Claire's house once again. She sighed, arms crossed. "You have a habit of loitering outside my door." Ethan smirked, but there was no humor in his eyes. "How long?" Claire frowned. "How long what?" "How long until Theo trusts me?" His voice was quieter than he meant it to be. Claire sighed, stepping onto the porch. "Theo doesn't just trust with words, Ethan. He trusts with time." Ethan nodded, absorbing her words. "And you?" Claire stiffened. "I don't want to just be a father to them, Claire," he admitted. "I want to be here. For them. For you." She exhaled sharply, looking away. "Ethan, I know I messed up," he continued. "I made the wrong choice, and I won't ask you to forget that. But I need to know, do I have a chance to fix this?" Claire swallowed hard. I don't know, she admitted. But if you're serious about being in their lives, don't just be present. Be consistent. Her words echoed in his mind long after she closed the door. And Ethan knew this was only the beginning of the battle. The scandal strikes. Ethan should have expected it. He had managed to stay under the radar for a few weeks, keeping his time with the boys as private as possible. But when you were one of the most powerful men in New York, privacy was an illusion. The headlines hit like a storm. Billionaire Ethan Caldwell's secret twins. Ex-fiancée Charlotte Harrington speaks out. Who is Claire Thompson, the woman who stole Ethan Caldwell's heart, and then his heirs? Paparazzi swarmed outside Claire's home. Journalists speculated about Ethan's past, their relationship, and his sudden interest in fatherhood. And worst of all, the boys had been dragged into the chaos. Claire called him, her voice shaking with anger. I had to pull them out of daycare today, Ethan. They followed us. Ethan clenched his fists. I'll handle it. No, Claire snapped. You should have handled it before it got to this point. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling inside him. I didn't think. That's the problem. Claire interrupted. You didn't think about what this would mean for them. You never had to live with cameras outside your door, but we do now. His stomach twisted. Claire, please. She exhaled, her voice raw. I don't know if I can do this, Ethan. The line went dead. Ethan stared at his phone, his mind racing. This wasn't just about proving himself anymore. This was about protecting them. And for the first time, he realized he was going to have to fight harder than ever to do it. Fighting for family. Ethan's grip on his phone tightened as he sat in the back seat of his Blacktown car, his driver weaving through the chaotic streets of New York. His mind was a storm of emotions. Anger at the media for violating the privacy of his sons, frustration at himself for not anticipating this, and fear that Claire might shut him out completely. He had built an empire that could crush competition overnight, manipulate the stock market with a single deal, and bend politicians to his will. But none of that power meant anything now. Because the only thing he wanted, the only thing that mattered, was the one thing he could lose if he didn't act fast. His family. Confronting the enemy. Ethan knew exactly who was responsible for the media firestorm. Charlotte Harrington. He had broken off their engagement, walked away from a multi-billion-dollar merger, and in doing so, made her the laughingstock of high society. He had underestimated how far she would go to retaliate. And now, his sons were caught in the crossfire. Ethan stormed into Harrington Tower, his presence alone causing a ripple of tension among the employees. Secretaries whispered, security straightened their postures, and executives stepped out of his way as he marched toward the private elevator that led to Charlotte's office. Her assistant barely had time to react before Ethan shoved the doors open. Charlotte was seated at her sleek glass desk, a glass of red wine in her hand, as if she had been expecting him. She didn't flinch as he stepped inside, slamming the door behind him. I assume you've seen the news, she said smoothly, sipping her wine. Ethan clenched his jaw. You did this. She smirked. Oh, Ethan, you can't seriously be surprised. His patience snapped. You leaked my son's existence to the press. You put children, my children, in danger. Charlotte exhaled, swirling her wine glass. They were going to find out eventually. I just expedited the process. Ethan's hands curled into fists. What do you want? She tilted her head, pretending to think. An apology. Maybe for you to admit that walking away from me was a mistake. He scoffed. It wasn't. Charlotte's eyes flashed with something dark. And yet, here you are, begging for my help. I'm not begging, Ethan said, his voice low and lethal. I'm giving you a warning. She raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Oh, you have power, Charlotte, he admitted. But so do I. And if you don't pull back, if you don't put an end to this media circus you started, I will dedicate every resource I have to ruining you. Charlotte's smirk faltered just slightly. You think your father's money protects you. Ethan continued, stepping closer. Your family's reputation. I am the reputation that keeps businesses afloat in this city, and I can make sure the Harrington name is nothing more than a footnote in history. Charlotte's jaw tightened. You wouldn't dare. Ethan smiled coldly. Try me. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Finally, Charlotte set her wineglass down and exhaled sharply. Fine, she muttered. I'll call off my contacts. Ethan didn't thank her. He simply turned and walked out. Because this wasn't about Charlotte anymore. This was about proving to Claire and to his sons that he could protect them. The damage already done. By the time Ethan arrived at Claire's house, the damage had already been done. Reporters had been chased off, but the intrusion had left its mark. The curtains were drawn, the front porch light was off, and the entire house seemed smaller, not in size, but in spirit. Ethan knocked once. No answer. He tried again. This time, the door cracked open just enough for Claire to glare at him. Ethan, I'm tired, she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was exhausted. Ethan exhaled. Let me fix this. She shook her head. You can't just fix things like they're a business deal. I stopped the media storm, he said, voice firm. Charlotte won't be a problem anymore. Claire's expression flickered, but the walls around her remained. That doesn't change what's already happened, she whispered. Do you know what I had to tell Oliver and Theo today? Why we couldn't go to the park? Why people with cameras were following us? Ethan's stomach twisted. Claire. She shook her head. I told them it wasn't their fault. That it was because of you. His breath caught. Oliver. He was fine. He's resilient. Her voice wavered. But Theo. He asked me if you were going to leave again. Ethan's chest tightened like a vice. Claire met his eyes then, and for the first time, he saw the raw pain in them. That's what this has done to them. It's not just about getting rid of the press, Ethan. It's about proving to them that you aren't temporary. Ethan swallowed hard. Then he made a choice. Taking the leap. The next morning, Ethan called a press conference. He stood before the cameras, not as Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire CEO, but as a father. There has been speculation and intrusion into my personal life over the past few weeks, he began, his voice steady. And I will not stand by while my family is put under a microscope. The cameras clicked, reporters leaned forward, and the city held its breath. I have 2 sons, he said. Their names are Oliver and Theo, and I will not allow them to be used as pawns in a media circus. His voice hardened. They are not a scandal. They are my children. He turned slightly, looking directly at the cameras. To anyone who thinks they can profit from exploiting them, this is your first and only warning. The message was clear. Ethan Caldwell had spent years protecting his empire. Now he was protecting something far more valuable. A mother's decision. Claire watched the press conference from her living room, her heart pounding. She had never expected Ethan to go public like this. She had never expected him to choose them over his carefully controlled image. When the conference ended, the phone rang. It was Ethan. Claire hesitated before answering. I meant what I said, he told her. Claire swallowed. I know. A pause. Then, softer. Can I see them? She looked toward the stairs, where Oliver and Theo were playing. And for the first time in 3 years, Claire wanted to say yes. She took a deep breath. Come over for dinner, she said. Ethan exhaled in relief. I'll be there. As she hung up, Claire realized something she had been too afraid to acknowledge before. Ethan wasn't just fighting for his sons. He was fighting for her too. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could win. Rebuilding what was lost. Ethan sat in his car outside Claire's house, gripping the steering wheel as nerves twisted in his stomach. He had sealed billion-dollar mergers with more confidence than he felt right now. But this wasn't business. This was family. His family. And tonight was the first real step toward proving to them that he wasn't just passing through. He stepped out of the car, inhaling the crisp evening air. The house was warm, inviting, a stark contrast to his cold penthouse. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it felt like home in a way his luxurious world never had. He knocked once. The door opened to reveal Claire, her expression unreadable. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Hey," she replied. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside. "Come in." Ethan entered, his eyes immediately drawn to the small family space. Photos of the boys on the walls, scattered toys on the floor, the scent of something homemade lingering in the air. It was overwhelming. And yet it felt right. A father's first dinner. Oliver was the first to appear, bounding into the room with the same bold energy he always carried. "You're late," he announced, hands on his hips. Ethan chuckled. "I think I'm right on time." Oliver squinted at him before shrugging. "Okay, but you better like spaghetti." "Spaghetti's my favorite," Ethan said, playing along. Oliver grinned. "Good, 'cause Mom burns chicken sometimes." "Oliver." Claire called from the kitchen, exasperated but amused. Ethan laughed, feeling the tension ease just slightly. Then he saw Theo. The quieter twin stood near the doorway, half hidden behind the wall. He wasn't clinging to Claire this time, but he wasn't running up to Ethan either. Instead, he was watching. Ethan knew by now that Theo didn't trust words. He trusted actions, and Ethan was determined to prove himself. So instead of forcing interaction, he simply gave Theo a nod. "Hey, buddy." Theo stared at him for a moment, then gave a tiny nod in return. It wasn't much, but it was something. A dinner of unspoken bonds. The meal was surprisingly normal. Ethan sat across from the boys, watching as Oliver talked animatedly about dinosaurs, while Theo quietly twirled his spaghetti around his fork. Claire was focused on making sure no one spilled sauce on the table, occasionally glancing at Ethan, as if studying how he fit into this moment. And for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't thinking about deals, negotiations, or press scandals. He was just here. "So, Dad," Oliver said suddenly, tilting his head. Ethan nearly choked on his water. Oliver had never called him that before. The title hit him harder than expected, knocking the breath from his lungs. Claire froze mid-motion, her eyes widening slightly, as if she hadn't expected it either. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay steady. "Yeah." Oliver smirked. "If you had to fight a T-Rex or a Spinosaurus, which one would you pick?" Ethan exhaled, relief washing over him. "T-Rex. Hands down." Oliver gasped dramatically. "Wrong answer." "What?" "T-Rex is the king of dinosaurs." Oliver wagged a finger. "Spinosaurus is bigger." Ethan leaned forward, feigning deep contemplation. "Okay, but the T-Rex has stronger bite force." Oliver nodded approvingly. "That's true. I guess that's an okay answer." Ethan chuckled, his heart feeling lighter. Then, something unexpected happened. Theo, who had been silent for most of dinner, suddenly spoke. "Brachiosaurus would win," he murmured. Ethan turned to him, surprised. Theo wasn't looking at him directly, but his small voice carried weight. Ethan smiled. "You think so?" Theo nodded. "It's really big. And really strong." Ethan took a chance. "Maybe we should go to the museum this weekend. See some real fossils." Theo hesitated. Then, to Ethan's complete shock, he nodded. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Claire saw it too. And for the first time that night, her expression softened. A private conversation. After dinner, Claire walked Ethan to the door while the boys played in the living room. "That was better than I expected," she admitted. Ethan exhaled. "Yeah." She folded her arms, glancing toward the boys. "Oliver's easy. Theo takes time." "I know," Ethan said softly, "but I'm willing to wait." Claire looked at him then, really looked at him. "You're trying," she murmured. Ethan met her gaze. "I don't want to just be someone who drops in and out of their lives. I want to be here, always." Claire swallowed. "That's what they need." "And you?" Ethan asked carefully. She tensed slightly, her guard going up again. "This isn't about me, Ethan." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It is about you. You and I. We have history. And I know I hurt you. But I also know that I still—" She held up a hand, stopping him. "I can't go there," she whispered. "Not yet." Ethan nodded, understanding. "But maybe one day." Claire hesitated. Then, very quietly, she said, "Maybe." Ethan exhaled, a slow smile forming. It wasn't a promise, but it was hope. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The bond that was forming. That night, Ethan sat in his penthouse, staring at his phone. A message from Claire appeared. "Claire, Theo asked about you before bed." Ethan's chest tightened. Then another message followed. "Claire, Oliver said you have to pick a dinosaur by the weekend." Ethan laughed softly, and with steady hands, he typed his reply. "Ethan, tell them I've made my choice. Brachiosaurus." A minute later, Claire responded. "Claire, good choice." Ethan put his phone down and leaned back. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing deals, control, or power. He was chasing something real. And this time, he wasn't going to lose it. A forever choice. Ethan had spent his entire life making decisions that shaped industries, controlled markets, and built empires. He had lived in a world where power was everything, where emotions were just distractions. But this was the only decision that had ever truly mattered. His sons, Claire, his family. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. The day that changed everything. It had been 2 weeks since his first dinner at Claire's house. 2 weeks of picking Oliver and Theo up from daycare. 2 weeks of bedtime stories, dinosaur debates, and quiet walks in the park. 2 weeks of Theo slowly, finally, trusting him. And 2 weeks of seeing Claire every day, watching her walls waver just a little more each time. Now, as Ethan stood outside their home again, he felt a familiar nervousness creep into his chest. This wasn't a business meeting. This wasn't a negotiation. This was something far more delicate, something that could break if he wasn't careful. He knocked once. Claire opened the door, already dressed to go out. "You're on your own tonight," she said, raising an eyebrow. Ethan blinked. "What?" Claire smirked. "I have dinner plans with a friend, which means you are officially on full dad duty." Ethan's heart pounded. "Alone?" Claire shrugged. "You said you wanted to be present. This is part of it." Ethan swallowed. Not that he was afraid. Okay, maybe a little. But this was different. This wasn't just visiting or spending time with them while Claire was nearby. This was real. This was fatherhood. Claire hesitated, as if second-guessing herself. "I can cancel." "No," Ethan said quickly. "Go. Have fun." Claire studied him for a moment before nodding. "Call me if anything happens." Then she was gone, and Ethan was left standing in the doorway as 2 identical pairs of gray eyes stared up at him. Oliver grinned. "So, what's for dinner?" Theo tilted his head. "You can't burn spaghetti, right?" Ethan exhaled. "Let's find out." A night to remember. He survived dinner. Barely. Turns out, spaghetti could, in fact, be burned. But after some emergency grilled cheese sandwiches, the crisis was averted. Then came the next challenge. Bedtime. Oliver, naturally, had 0 issues. He bounced onto his bed, holding up a book. This one. Ethan took the book and started reading. But it was Theo, the quiet one, the observer, who hesitated. Ethan noticed him lingering near the door, staring at his bed but not moving toward it. "Theo," Ethan said softly. Theo shifted from foot to foot. Mom always reads to me. Ethan's heart clenched. I can read to you, he offered carefully. Theo bit his lip, clearly debating. After a long pause, he nodded and climbed into bed. Ethan took the book and began reading, his voice steady but gentle. Halfway through, he noticed something. Theo had inched closer. Not enough to touch, but enough to trust. And when Ethan finished the story, Theo murmured, "You didn't do too bad." Ethan smiled. High praise. Then, to his absolute shock, Theo reached out and grabbed his hand. Ethan froze. Theo squeezed once before letting go and rolling onto his side. It was a small gesture, but for Theo, it was everything. And for Ethan, it was the moment he knew he was never leaving again. The final step. When Claire returned home later that night, she found Ethan sitting on the couch, staring at the wall. She raised an eyebrow. Are they still alive? Ethan smirked. Barely. Claire laughed softly, slipping off her coat. But before she could say anything else, Ethan spoke. I'm moving back to New York permanently. Claire froze. What? I'm not leaving again, he said firmly. I'm not going back to my old life. Claire hesitated. Ethan. I want to be here. For Oliver. For Theo. He took a breath. And for you. Claire's face softened, but there was still hesitation in her eyes. I don't know if. I'm not asking you to make a decision right now, Ethan interrupted. I just need you to know. I'm all in. Claire swallowed hard. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand. Ethan stilled as her fingers curled around his. I can trust easily, she whispered. I know, he said. She took a shaky breath. Then prove it to me, Ethan. And he would. Because for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he belonged. The forever choice. Months passed. Ethan built his life around his sons, not outside of them. He attended school meetings. He helped with homework. He memorized every dinosaur name Oliver threw at him and learned exactly which bedtime stories soothed Theo to sleep. And Claire. She watched. She waited. And one evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching Oliver and Theo chase fireflies in the yard, she reached for his hand without hesitation. Ethan turned to her, searching her face. She smiled softly. And he knew. She had made her choice too. The right choice. The choice they should have made all those years ago. The choice that changed everything. And this time, neither of them was walking away.